Well, hello, Living Streams. Welcome to our deep dive podcast. We've been going through our Shalom series. And this Sunday, CJ Bergman, who's joining us with his wife, Renee, or rather, CJ, the husband of Renee,
That's right.
is joining us. Renee is our women's pastor. CJ is just a really cool guy who happens to be married to Renee.
Yes.
And hang out here at Living Streams. But CJ brought us through a really, really good sermon. That was incredibly fruitful, I think, for a lot of people, and probably profoundly uncomfortable for at least a handful, right?
I would think so.
Yeah, we're talking about sexual shalom, so not an easy phrase to say over and over again. But really, I think, CJ, you did such a beautiful job at talking about the stuff that is difficult to engage with, difficult to talk about, but actually really, really important. Like you and I were talking between services about how oftentimes when we do say, hey, you know what, we're going to be uncomfortable, we're going to talk about sex and sexuality and purity and holiness in that regards, it's usually primarily geared towards abstaining.
Yeah.
In really good ways, right? I mean, and in plenty of churches, that conversation doesn't even happen. But
Right.
abstaining, dealing with sexual brokenness, avoiding sexual sin, like, okay, if you're single, how do you manage your sexual desires? If you're married, how do you keep your sexual desires pointed at your spouse?
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. But this was the other side of the coin that we don't have to talk about, and just. Other than to say like, hey, sex is really good in the confines of marriage. We do, maybe not every church says that. I think that's a pretty comfortable thing for us to say around here at Living Streams. But to actually get in there and say, okay, well, here's some practicals. Here's some things that actually can help lead towards cultivating that healthy sexual relationship, sexual intimacy within the confines of a marriage. So that was really powerful. But before we unpack that and dive into that, and hopefully time allowing, maybe we'll dive in a little bit with even some of those responses if we have that from the marriage survey that we did a little while back.
Okay, yeah.
But before we do any of that, how's your guys' week going? It's been actually a pretty intense week for you guys, a little bit, hasn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
More so for Renee.
We're doing good. We're doing good. Yeah,
doing good.
Healing up.
Yeah, good.
Getting
Glad to
teeth
hear
pulled
that.
out, but
Oh, fun.
we're all right.
Yeah, everybody enjoys
Yeah.
the dentist. You and I were talking about it earlier, and you were saying it's literal torture.
It is,
and
yeah.
it's true. The dentist is actually like, there's not a lot of difference other than the dentist is
That's
ultimately
right.
trying to help you.
That's
But-
right.
But a torturer
Yep.
would
Pulling
do
you
the
to
same
do
thing.
more.
POW.
is-
It's like you're a
yeah.
POW, but they're for you in the end.
Yes, exactly.
But
Yeah.
during it, it's identical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally relevant here. I don't know if this is
Yeah.
true or not, but I'm under the impression that it is true. Apparently, dentists rank among the highest for both suicide rates and fidelity
Well,
in
interesting.
marriage. Go figure.
Okay.
Don't
Man,
know.
maybe I should have gone down that road for my marriage sermon.
Yeah.
What can we learn from
What
dentists?
can,
What
we
can we
learn
learn
from a
from dentists?
dentist?
And what can we not learn?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
Go
Hopefully
figure.
those two things are not correlated, right?
Yeah, I would-
Fidelity and suicide. Those are not.
I suppose not.
That's
I mean,
coincidental.
I suppose one narrative might be that they're so used to torturing everybody, they figure like, I can't leave. Like nobody else is gonna
Yeah, maybe.
hang out there, be afraid I'm gonna torture their mouth or something like that. So
Yeah.
lucky I got someone to stick with me.
I guess.
Who knows? But yeah, CJ, could you kind of walk us through your message a little bit? Kind of flyover for those who
Yep.
missed it, or refresher for those who didn't.
Yeah, so I kind of started with looking at God's nature, and he's in a mutually submissive relationship with himself and the Godhead, right? Triune, three persons, one God, Father, Son, and Spirit, living in this like shalom relational dynamic of always giving, always receiving, never taking, never withholding. And we are in a shalom series, and so I wanted to start with focusing on God's nature and character, and where does this idea of shalom even come from? And it comes from God, and then gets reflected, in all different ways in the world, and specifically sexuality. Between a man and a woman who are married together really represents that. And so I wanted to really paint this like beautiful picture of how sex is God's good intention and his creation and a reflection of his nature and character. And then recognize that, Satan is trying to do all he can to tear that down and, distort that picture. And so, but pointing back to the gospel, that Jesus can't be overcome by the world. He can't. He will not be defeated in our sexuality. And so I just really wanted to start with and overall, I wanted to preach a very sex positive sermon, a hopeful sermon, with recognition of the things that are broken. So we looked at 1 Corinthians 7.
For context, when you say sex positive, you mean that in a healthy, I mean, obviously, anybody listening to the last 30 seconds of our dialogue, in a healthy, biblical, in the confines,
Yes.
Just slightly worth noting, because sometimes you hear some people
Confines
hear
of
what you
marriage.
didn't say.
Very worth noting, yes.
And that usually when we hear that phrase, it's in the context of hey, sex, great,
Yeah,
everybody all the
right.
time, whenever, whatever makes you feel good.
Yeah, not sex positivity in the way the world says, but biblically speaking, yes. So, there's a lot of different passages that I could have used. Song of Solomon is an obvious place, and I thought about that. But I just really, 1 Corinthians 7 kept coming to mind. And I think it's because it's where couples are at, where Satan has been productive in harming that aspect of marriages. I've seen that in a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so, Paul's addressing the Corinthian church who at the time were steeped in Gnostic thinking, which is that the body is separate from the spirit and all things material are evil and all things spiritual are good. And so there's this dichotomy, this dualism of I am not my body. My body is this temporary broken vessel, and my soul and my spirit is who I really am. And so people are either saying that means I can just have as much sex as I want, extramarital sex. I can do anything I want, and it has no bearing on my person, which is false. Or interestingly, you had people that were I'm so holy that even though we're married, we shouldn't have sex for the sake of holiness.
Yeah.
And Paul clears that up.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, dude, that's not the way it is in the Bible. So I kind of walked through that and talked about how I think, Satan's strategy to either get people to pursue licentiousness and just indulgence sexually, or to get them to withhold is still his strategy today in marriages. So we're facing the same thing that Corinth was facing. I don't think we're facing the temptation for asceticism. I don't know of a lot of couples that were our main problem is that we pray too much and never have sex.
Yeah.
I never heard that. I think we're withholding for different reasons. So I was all right, let's figure out what the reasons are that we're withholding. What does withholding look like today?
Yeah.
And I tried to avoid over gender stereotyping, but if I had to, it would be men who are withholding really good, comprehensive, holistic, gratifying sex for their wives. They're reducing it down to particularly intercourse. And then wives who are struggling to withhold in general, where I mostly hear about men who wish there was more sex in their marriage. So it kind of walked through that. And then I gave a bunch of tips and tricks from CJ.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and really good, fruitful ones, I would say. It's good to, I think that inclination right there to pack so much in, but to know hey, at this point, the practical would be fruitful. I was chatting with one guy who I know pretty well after service, who's a single guy, and just asking him, we were talking about a bunch of stuff, but among the things we talked about, I said, hey, how did this hit for you?
Right.
And he was like, this was really, really, really good. He said it's challenging because I'm how do I, he was someone actually who had, within the last year, got out of a serious relationship with someone. Was saying I was gearing up to I was not so long ago in the phase of life where I'm considering preparing for engaging in some of these things directly, but now I'm downshifting from that, but still wanted to lock this stuff away. And then also, like you and I were talking about between services, I think you mentioned during second service, trying to pull this stuff into my walk with the Lord, because there is something, in fact, in that conversation, I was talking about how Rob Bell, rest in peace, though he's still alive. For those of you who don't know, Rob Bell.
We're just quoting
pastor.
John Piper's tweet about Rob Bell. That's what he said. Like,
Oh, no.
R.I.P.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah, he said R.I.P. Rob Bell or something like that.
No, I
farewell.
didn't
Maybe he
even
said
know.
farewell. Okay, I didn't know if you were channeling that.
I was on Team Rob Bell for so long, but
Yep.
he has definitely
Fallen off
walked
the
away
bandwagon.
from
He
orthodoxy
did leave that.
and a healthy. And I think he's leading people astray. But there was once a point in time when people claimed he was doing that, and I thought, no, you're not. Like the first few of his books, I can see the trajectory people were concerned about. But he wrote a book called Sex God, with which I have no problem.
Right.
And his premise there was essentially, I think he even hits it in the forward or the very first chapter. He's saying, hey, if everything is always about sex in our world, well, what is it that sex is about?
Yeah, right.
And of course, sex is ultimately about intimacy and is ultimately a picture of intimacy with God.
Yeah.
And so even for the person who is single and never going to be married,
Right.
or the person who's divorced and not married, or the person
Yeah.
who's single for a period of time or whatever, or widowed and is like, hey, like that's it, that's it for me as far as that goes. Even for those people, still learning this stuff is ultimately, if you're digging one layer deeper, you're learning about God. And that's even was the place you started, was with the Trinity, And so as we look at what is the practical outworking, it's like among many other forms of relationship and intimacy, sex is one way in which God is saying, hey, I want you to practically learn something about like real intimacy, about the intimacy within the confines of the Trinity, about what love actually is. And of course, for those who are not or will never have any physical sexual intimacy, that doesn't put them without a nearly infinite number of ways in which they can learn about the intimacy of the Godhead. But, what were some things? How about pivot, Renee? Sitting there, did you catch your husband's sermon yesterday?
I did. Yeah.
What were some things that you would add or color or?
I think when it comes to sexuality within the church, first off, I grew up in like hardcore purity culture that I think was very, very damaging. It was damaging to my soul. It was damaging to our early marriage. And so even in him starting to...
Could you frame that slightly for some people?
Yeah.
I've realized lately, not everybody knows what the heck you're talking about when you say that.
So I grew up in a really conservative church that... I'll give you an example. I would show up to youth group, and if my youth pastor deemed that my skirt was too short, then I wasn't allowed to sit down during service. I needed to stand in the back because I needed my legs to not be shown.
Yeah.
So it was drawing boundary lines that were, I believe, outside the confines of what God is asking of withholding sexuality, right? As a teenager, and living in this world of, any physical touch was sinful, which, it's dicey. I have teenagers these days, right? So, and teenage girls coming over all the time, hanging out with my teenage boy, and all the things are running through my mind of, what's appropriate and what's not.
Yeah.
But
it's conflating. It's conflating sin with unwise.
Yes.
And then I think that would be a key component for me of defining what was off in purity culture.
Yes.
And saying, hey, kissing a boy is sinful.
Yes.
Well, no, but
Right.
it might be really stupid for you at this particular moment in time.
Right.
And then the other thing I think is pretty fundamental to the issues of purity culture is, in my estimation, it was us removing the gospel from sexual brokenness.
Yes.
And saying, hey, in all forms of life and all sins, there's forgiveness, there's redemption. The Lord can rebuild. He can build purity in you. But when it comes to sexuality, you have a purity card, sometimes a literal purity card.
Oh, I had a purity ring.
And once it's lost,
Yes.
it's lost, and there's nothing that can be done.
Yes.
Which is like, well, where the heck did the gospel go?
Right. Yeah. So it created a lot of tension for me in understanding healthy sexuality. I never had anyone in the church telling me sex was good, that it was right.
Right.
And I remember even upon us getting married, having this moment of like, how do I switch my brain
Yeah.
from this is evil and wrong to all of a
Dirty.
sudden really and dirty
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
all of a sudden beautiful and God honoring.
Right.
It
It's
was
now all of a sudden an act of worship.
yeah, it's an act of
The
worship.
absolute
And
opposite.
it for so many years it was told to me as a woman, the reason that men around you are sinning is because you are doing things with your body that
Yeah.
are tempting them, right? Like
Yeah.
that was kind of the core of living in this hardcore purity culture
Yeah.
as a female.
Do you think you heard that articulated, or was that implied? I'm just
I think
curious.
it was
I know
said.
it's happened in both.
Yeah, it was said. I existed in a pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, I don't think there's ever a world in which a girl shows up to a youth group. They say, "I don't want you to sit down because your skirt is too short."
Yeah.
That's just not an appropriate,
Yeah. No. I
right? Like
It's like placing a burden and responsibility
Yeah.
on your shoulders to like not.
that was just far beyond what even my brain really understood
Yeah.
or could wrap my head around. Of like,
Yeah.
wait, am I making you sin? Am I making
Right.
Yeah.
the boys in front of me sin? Am I?
Yeah,
What's
right.
the issue, right?
Yeah.
So like, I'm not acceptable at church because of my
Yeah.
sexuality.
Yeah. I think that it's been as a youth pastor working through those things. One of the things that occurred to me and that I witnessed was that kind of engagement actually one of the really there's two majorly destructive components of it. One is the somewhat obvious impact on the girl who's being told like, "Hey, you are an object of sin." Regardless of the content of your heart. I mean, there's a whole different conversation to have with a girl who might actually be saying, I would like to intentionally, actively pursue inappropriate attention. In other words, I'm actually, or even like I'm wanting to seduce. Okay, there's a sinful thing. We can address that. But that's quite a bit different from the average 15-year-old girl who's just like, oh, I thought this looks cute.
Yes.
But I think the flip side of that coin is what it's doing to the guys around, saying, hey, this actually is not yours to own.
Yeah.
Your thought life, the content of your heart, the existence or absence of lust in your heart, like this is something that needs to be managed by controlling the women around you.
Yeah.
And that's not fruitful. That's
It's
quite
not.
counterproductive. And that's why, you can see that same human brokenness working its way to the extreme in perhaps a culture where women are going to cover head to toe.
Yes.
And yet you still have major issues with male lust and the outworkings of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, when I started that point and when we were discussing this sermon and me hearing CJ kind of work all this through, this is something we talk a lot about. We've met with a lot of couples about that. We've counseled a lot of people in. We've done a lot of our own work. You have to rewind and go back to what are the basics that led me into having wrong thinking about sexuality and about sex in marriage. And that was sort of like some of my starting point. And so even in CJ talking about how Paul says, I can't tell you how many times I've heard women be so upset about this particular passage where it says that men have the right to a woman's body, right? And like, if that is pulled out separate, believe me, my dukes are up as well.
Yeah.
Right. But when you really look at what was happening in the culture and you exegete the passage and you realize that Paul is saying, this is a good thing because I'm actually saying that both of you have rights to each other's bodies.
Yep.
That the man doesn't have rights to his bodies without you saying as well. And that's such a shift in what culture is talking about. It gives you this heart for the fight that needs to happen in today's culture too, because that is true, right? We're living in a sex positive world of outside of the confines of marriage where it's no big deal to have sex with lots of people. It's no big deal to read erotic literature and dream of somebody else in your life as a woman, or to reconnect with someone online that you went to high school with and have these like, kind of side relationships that are fulfilling parts of your life. Right.
Yeah.
And so I love this passage because when you really do dive into it, it gives a lot of freedom as a woman. And coming from a place of purity culture and coming into a marriage where we've had to do a lot of work in our sex life and had to.
There's no one that doesn't.
No one doesn't.
Yeah.
Nobody doesn't have the work.
It's a requirement.
Yeah, it's a requirement.
Yeah.
It doesn't just naturally come. But when you do all that work and you start to get to see the fruit of that labor, and yes, in the like intimate, private parts of the actual act of sex, sure, that has happened. But I've just seen it expand what CJ talked about in the sermon of like our view of sex in our home has just expanded so much. And I think it's enabled my love for God so much to be so much broader and so much more intimate in ways that I didn't know it could be intimate.
Yeah.
Which in turn makes me have more intimacy with CJ and more intimacy with my children. My kids get to see that sex is a way of life. And I know that sounds like a weird thing. Like, obviously, I am not saying that our children have any understanding of,
I think what
our
you're
private sex life, but sex in the definition of intimacy between husband and wife and being in the kitchen and talking and prioritizing each other and knowing that we like each other, being grossed out by the fact that we kiss each other around them, that CJ might walk by and smack me, in a way that they're like, oh gosh, Dad, those are positive things that many of us that grew up in a purity culture never experienced. If you grew up in a very like conservative culture where sex was so private, you didn't learn all those pieces in the positive, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's our job to then talk to our children about what healthy sexuality is and where those lines are drawn with them at their ages and when you explore outside of certain things. All of that is important. And we're by no means saying that, kids need to understand the fullness of sex, at this phase of life. But they do need to see that sex is important in their parents' marriages. And I wish I would have had that.
Yeah.
I think it would have saved me a lot of, heartache in our early marriage years.
Yeah.
Well, it's the job of parents primarily to teach biblical sexuality to their kids and to model it.
Yeah.
They teach way more.
You mean it's not their phone's job to do that?
No.
Or Disney?
The phones and Disney have decided that it is their job.
They think it is.
And that's and that really is those are the stakes, right? Like the stakes are, who do you want your child to learn about sexuality from?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's either you or a myriad of other people. And those people are actively wanting to educate your kids, right? And so, so I think we all, had to greater or lesser degree, like a good example from our parents. And for no matter how good your parents were, they let you down in some way in that way. We're letting our kids down in some way in that regard.
Yeah. We're not doing
but
it
if you
perfectly.
don't have that model, you really have to do some extra work to figure it out. And both of us had to do that. Both of us had to do some extra work and have had to do some extra work.
Yeah.
I think I had two thoughts, just kind of riffing off what you were saying, Renee. One was, this is what you were hitting on. I think you hit it on it in your sermon concerning the passage in 1 Corinthians. When you're talking about, your body belongs to your husband, your body belongs to your wife. What was not shocking to the Corinthians, and this is often like basically any of the verses that have to do with men and women that shock us. This could be said of those verses in the New Testament. The original readers, the first century Greco-Roman world, the first century Hebrew world, would be shocked in the exact opposite way that we are. in the Greco-Roman world, I think you said this, maybe not. Like a woman was literally the property
Yeah.
of her husband.
Yeah.
And there were conversations actually, different kinds of marriages of like, oh, does a woman actually like a better form of marriage for women's rights would have been one where the woman remains the property of her husband of her father and not her husband.
Right.
Like these were tensions that actually were being worked out in the first century or so.
Yeah, right.
But essentially she was property.
Totally.
And of more or less a similar tier of property that the children would have been,
Yeah.
but again, property, and the husband retained the property rights, just like any other animal or object or slave or whatever, with minor differences.
Yeah.
And so it was a no duh that the husband had rights over his wife's body. The shocking thing is to say this woman who legally is considered property of this man has rights over his body.
Yep.
That is absolutely revolutionary. I mean, that's the kind of thing that had the ancient Greco-Roman world wanting to burn Christians. And so that is really important to say because this is the ammunition that people have when they say the Bible is so oppressive and misogynistic and anti-women. It's like, actually, it is the wild opposite of that.
Yeah.
Pro-woman.
So that at first, and then the second response I had to what you're saying when you're just talking about, in the confines of your marriage and your family and teaching healthy sexuality and things like that. One of the frameworks that's been really helpful for me, and I can't remember if it was Rebecca McLaughlin or Nancy Pearcey in one of their books, two of the most intelligent authors I know of who are still writing books today. But one of them talks about this issue of conflating different intimacies and how much destruction happens when we do that. And when we conflate one sort of intimacy with another intimacy, it actually destroys intimacy. And that there are different kinds of intimacy, right? There's, I don't think in her book she sets out to be super exhaustive in this, but right, you have romantic intimacy, erotic intimacy, you have parent-child and child-parent intimacy, you have brother-sister, sister-brother, you have friend intimacy, you have all of these intimacies, and they do although they're distinct from each other, you can learn a lot about all intimacies by really studying or mastering or diving deep into any of those intimacies, right? But when we mix them is when things get messy, right? Or when we mix the wrong pair. Obviously, like friendship intimacy, erotic intimacy with friendship intimacy in the confines of a marriage can be really good. Take that outside of the confines of a marriage and you get friends with benefits and things get destroyed. It doesn't last, know? And then the most unpleasant, the most horrible conflation that happens that makes it very clear, I think she uses it in her book to say that, hey, sex isn't the ultimate form of intimacy. There are these other loves that have other ultimate manifestations. But she points out when you take, parental intimacy and mix that with erotic intimacy, all intimacy is implodes in that. It's one of the worst things that we can do. And her point in saying that in her book is that, like, hey, parental intimacy is apex intimacy. Like, there is a form of apex intimacy with a parent and a child, or a child and a parent, or between two friends, two brothers, two sisters, that has nothing to do with erotic intimacy. And one of the challenges we have in our culture is we have a tendency to assume that sexual intimacy is the ultimate intimacy, not just an ultimate intimacy. But all of that, my whole point in articulating that was, I think, getting at what you were saying, Renee, is like when we really learn about parental intimacy, we learn about friendship intimacy. We learn about romantic intimacy. When we really learn about intimacy with God, we learn about all these intimacies. And one of the unique things in a marriage is it's one of the few relationships, it probably is the relationship that is meant to have the most forms of intimacy. Maybe even all of them. Whereas, and then other than our relationship with God, maybe that's the only one that has all of them, and marriage is next to that. But you can find all those intimacies elsewhere, except for, well, you can find them anywhere you want, but erotic is meant to be in a marriage only. But hopefully I didn't lose you guys there.
That makes sense. I think that anytime we start talking about sex, people just have such a limited view on what sex is. And so I appreciate that CJ was trying to say, like, let's expand our view of what intimacy is, right? And sex is this piece that can be a part of intimacy.
Yeah.
But really what God designed us for is for intimate relationships,
Yeah.
right? And he has boundaries, just like there's boundaries within the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? Like there's boundaries within the three of them.
Yeah.
There's boundaries within us, even though we're one, right? So learning those tools is so critical in functioning as a human being, and yet most of our world is trying to tear all of those views down, like healthy views of how to do that. So you're just constantly fighting against it.
Well, and like you talked about, again, you rooted it in that always giving, always receiving, never taking, never withholding. And I think that's a perfect example of what we're talking about a little bit of, like that expands to all forms of intimacy.
Definitely.
And it has very tangible manifestations when it comes to sexual intimacy. I mean, that's the way to get where you're going.
Yep.
And even just in the way God has designed things to be what sometimes feels like mismatched, as far as how one gets to where you're trying to go when you're having intercourse or whatever, like, and needing to love, needing to give, needing, to not withhold, all of those things. Like it becomes literally to the point where, okay, either one person doesn't get here or does get here. And so much of the case is based off of whether that's happening. You had read some statistics in there, and I had, as far as intimacy and relationship and stuff like that, and I don't remember any of them in particular, but it jogged in my mind, reading that of the different subsets of American women, since we're having this topic, using these words, the subset of women in America who most frequently, most consistently is able to get where they're going in sexual
Have an orgasm.
intimacy. Yep, there you go. CJ's got he's got no shyness with the words.
Yeah, I said it a lot of times yesterday.
Yeah, you did. Yes, you did. Yesterday was definitely a let's not make eye contact in the courtyard kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
Like, hey, how's it going? Let's not.
I didn't even go out in the courtyard until later.
You just hide.
Only for everyone else's sake, so that they didn't have to talk to me. I'm fine talking to them. I just
But that subset is evangelical wives whose husbands actually attend church.
Interesting.
On a regular basis. Which, is not what How I Met Your Mother would make you believe.
That's right.
Or any other sitcom.
Totally.
And not to say that is true for every couple, that's the case at all. But generally speaking, that is true. And it does make sense, because at the end of the day, what do you have? You have husbands that are learning that all of their life is to serve.
Yeah, right.
And they're not of the mindset. They are, again, not all of them, not that they're not fighting this, not that they're don't have growth in this area, but they're on a trajectory that leads towards, hey, this is for you.
Yeah, right.
And it's going to work better for everybody when this is for the other person.
Tim Keller talks about in his book that, like, as you mature in this way, and this is one of the things I didn't really have time to get into, but and it's true in our marriage, as you mature in your sexuality with your spouse, increasingly over time, the pleasure that you get in the sexual experience is witnessing the pleasure of your partner, not experiencing your own pleasure.
Yep.
And that is a beautiful gift that only really mature people ever understand and get to. And it's the fruit of what you're talking about, of beginning with this notion of like, okay, so in this encounter, my number one goal is not to get my own needs met, but to make sure that Renee is getting her needs met. And Ed Wheat talks about this a ton in Intended for Pleasure, especially to like younger couples who are just getting started and everything, of like really encouraging, like, okay, you've got this young husband who thinks he's got all the moves because he's seen pornography, and he's totally wrong.
Yeah.
He doesn't have the moves. Okay. He doesn't understand his wife's anatomy or anything. Okay. So that was me like going in. I was like, I got this, dude.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go. And no, you don't. You don't got this. And just this like posture of let's take our time. We're not in any rush. I really want to please you and pleasure you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to do that. And this is not a burden for me, which was a lot of like the early times in our marriage of like helping Renee really feel like, hey, we're not in any rush here, and like you're not being selfish or putting me out in any way.
It's not a burden to let sex be discoverable and for sex to take time.
Yeah.
We just see in movies and obviously in pornography and and men are not the only ones that are caught up into pornography and women.
Erotic literature
is very
women.
popular with women.
Yeah.
And the reason being is that we want it to just like satisfy right away. There's like this idea of like there should be instant satisfaction and that it should just happen like this. And I think about the concept of marriage and God even instituting like a covenant like that. We live a lot less time than what people back then did, right? Like he knew we would be married for decades to one another if we live, if we live out the way that we're supposed to and we really stay committed to our relationships. Wouldn't it be that he would design something that is like changes and grows with age and maturity, and that we would find more and more pleasure in one another and we'd find more and more satisfaction? And I mean, seems like that makes sense that God would be that creative for us to, keep being able to discover. And
isn't that true of all intimacy, right? Like again, all of these lessons really are they parallel everywhere. Every relationship that's of value gets richer and richer and richer. And every relationship is based off of pursuing the joy, the pleasure of the other. Again, it feels like a weird pivot, but it is that parallel, different but parallel, right? But again, even with your kids, you watch that, right? Like the joy is in their joy. I hate Disneyland. I absolutely despise Disneyland. The years that I was the youth pastor, we did no Disneyland trips.
Wow.
Because I had
That's so
suffered
sad,
through
Alec.
as a youth leader. I know. But we went on vacation a few weeks ago and we went to Disneyland. For the first time with my kids, with my
joy.
baby, he's 6 months old. He wasn't doing much. And my 2.5-year-old. And I loved it.
They'll take every penny that you have.
Yeah, I'm a Magic Mountain guy,
watching
but I'll do Disneyland 1,000 times over with my 2.5-year-old before
amazing.
I do Magic Mountain again.
I know.
Because it's like your joy is in their joy, your pleasure is in their pleasure,
right.
and really like that's what God is trying to teach us with all of this intimacy. Is like. It's not about you. Like the things that will serve you are when you serve others.
Yeah, that's right.
When you lay yourself down, when you pursue the joy and the pleasure and the abundance for other people. It's gonna get you real good.
Yeah.
It's gonna be sweet and fruitful and good and beautiful and powerful and intimate.
Yeah.
CJ, I'm wondering what if anything didn't make it into the sermon? What got chopped?
I mean, there was a ton of stuff. Honestly, like this sermon. Probably had more cut out of it than almost any sermon I've preached in a while. One thing in particular that I had to take out like right at the last minute, I had mentioned at the very end, John Gottman. So I'm trained in a couples therapy modality called the Gottman method, which is John and his wife, Julie Gottman. John has been a research psychologist for decades. And so for years and years, he actually just observed couples and analyzed their behavior, like who had really good marriages, who had really good sex lives, all that. And he just like observed them. And then he met his wife, Julie, who was a therapist. And she's like, you can't just like collect all this data and not help people.
Yeah.
You know, like we got to do some therapy. So then she brought all the therapy to it. So anyway, I love John and Julie Gottman. They have a website with all kinds of amazing resources that I would encourage people. But he said, based on the research, that there are 13 things all couples do who have an amazing sex life. So this is just observation, right? Like they have a great sex life, and here are the reasons, or here are the things that they do. They say, I love you every day and mean it. They kiss one another passionately for no reason. There's actually like a statistic, I forget what it is, but like couples who kiss for at least 30 seconds have like longer, more sustained marriages, something like that. They give surprise romantic gifts. They know what turns their partners on and off erotically, which I mentioned that yesterday, of just like learning each other's bodies. They're physically affectionate, even in public. I kind of touched on that. They keep playing and having fun together. That's a really big one. What do you do to just like enjoy each other and laugh and have fun? They cuddle. Only 6% of couples who don't cuddle have a good sex life. So cuddling is like a huge marker of whether or not your sex life is going to be good. And this is like, I think really gets at like that when I said like practicing touch that doesn't lead to intercourse.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge problem in marriages that needs to be worked out.
Yeah.
They make sex a priority, not the last item of a long to-do list.
Can we pause on that
Yeah,
one? Because
yeah,
that's
please.
such a good point. And that's a huge point. I mean, that's like one of your like first sessions talking about this kind of points.
Oh yeah, dude.
often.
That's a big one.
And I know that recently it was a book I was reading where the author was making a really good point along that line, particularly when it comes to men, because often, one thing I think my dad observed that I've seen really clearly, right, is when we talk about love languages, a lot of guys whose love language is not physical touch will say it's physical touch, because really what they mean is they want physical touch.
Every 72 hours, I want to have sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that can be confusing.
Right.
But then you have the guys whose love language actually is physical touch. And I think David and I even talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago on the podcast, where our culture, for whatever reason, and you were talking about this a little bit, has basically deemed all physical touch, and really on all sides of it, on the Christian side, on the worldly side, has deemed all physical touch to be inherently sexual, unless it's in very specific confines. And we're terrified of it. I have a woman who's interning with us who was working with refugees and with children, and she's pivoting and she's working in our missions track and doing some stuff with the refugees. And she was saying, I'm so excited to be able to hug these kids because for years I've been a resource and someone who wants to love them as they're coming in and dealing, with traumatic things. And I just want to reach across the desk and hug them, but I can't even shake their hands, And so for a man in our culture whose love language is physical touch, one of the very, very, very few, if not the only place he's allowed to express that is in physical intimacy, is in sexual intimacy. And so for that particular guy, when there is a withholding going on, it's a double whammy.
Big time.
Or a triple whammy, because it's like,
time.
I can't hug my friends at work.
Right.
I can't hold people's hands.
Yeah.
I can't I cannot receive love or give love. And this is my only outlet for that.
Yeah.
And so I at some point I had a question in there for you in this regard. But I guess, your nods are confirming it. I mean, is that something that you see as an issue too, is that, or I guess, how do you see our culture's resistance to physical touch impacting and fueling that particular issue in marriages?
Yeah. I mean, you can look at research on infants who aren't touched will die.
Yeah.
Right. So the body is hardwired. Like we're hardwired as humans to experience touch, you know? So it's a genuine need. I talked about it in a sermon back in San Francisco. I remember telling a story about this guy who was single and lonely, had no friends, and he would go get his hair cut because that's the only place that he could ever get touched by a person, and how like sad that was.
Yeah.
And in that sermon, I said, we need to touch each other more. And then I had to talk about like, let me explain what I mean.
Yeah.
Because you say things like that, you know, to your point.
Yeah.
We need to touch each other more. You know, it's like the joke in the movie School of Rock where Jack Black is like, you know, your kids really touched me and I'm pretty sure I touched them. And all the like parents gasp, you know, it's like the joke of like, and then I experienced that in my world, right? Where like there's tremendous boundaries. Like I don't touch my clients at all, you know, and that's appropriate. And there's appropriateness about that. But yes, I think that our culture has absolutely conflated all physical touch with intimacy and sexuality. And it's really sad.
Yeah.
But I think it'd be good to hear from you on your side of, because that was like that point I made, maybe from your perspective, like anything else you want to say about that, but specifically like in our marriage, like how that process went.
I think there's multiple layers because as a female, you know, you're always, well, I know both female and male, you're careful about it. But as a female, I think a lot about early on in our marriage, we had to deal with the fact that I had been sexually abused as a kid. And I this has a point bringing around to the cuddling, I promise. Yeah. But that made me very, very like leery of any physical touch. And it's something I actually had suppressed it for most of my life. It wasn't until we were married and I was actually walking a college student. We were in college ministry, a college student through a book who had come and told me that she had been sexually abused and she had never told anyone. And so she was just too afraid to talk to anyone else. And so I was walking through her with a book and I began reading the book. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is my story. I can't believe I didn't know that this had happened and that this is what was going on. So I land, you know, in the parking lot of the church that CJ was working at, sobbing in the back of our car. And we start walking through a lot of that, like, just healing process. I had suppressed something that had communicated for so many years of my life that touch was so bad. And so many women in our culture, I mean, working full time here in the year that I have been here, the amount of women that have sat in my office and talked about how touch has been so violating to them.
Right.
So violating in so many different ways, in marriages, in parental, in friendships, in brother, sister. I mean, just in ways that sin has infiltrated touch. It's Satan's favorite way to hurt, I think, many, many people, men and women, right? And so when I first heard that statistic, I recoiled because I thought, you can't say that in a room where the statistics of how many women and men in this room have been so violated by touch. Right? But that comes around to this place of the reason the statistics look like what they do is because many people don't do the work to heal. And so we began to do the repair together. I went through sexual abuse therapy with CJ in every session. Every session. He was there through all of it. That was very, very hard. Talk about a lot of like tension between us physically because I was having to reopen these wounds that were just gaping and bleeding and so painful, right? So touch from him was no longer sacred and did not feel safe. And so I think when we talk about these things, it's such a it's so nuanced in the church because we're so afraid to talk about really hard things. We feel afraid to bring forth what that's resulted in, right? So for a lot of women statistically, and I'm just talking about women because I'm a woman, right? Like I know there are the statistics for the men as well because
Speak
I
for the
know
ladies.
plenty of men have been abused as well.
That's why you're here. Speak for the ladies.
But from a lady's perspective, so many women, when they have been abused, the process of going through healing can be so confusing within the church because the church doesn't do a good job historically at acknowledging pain in those arenas. And so a lot of women are really shut down in those spaces and places. So you might show up into, your pastor's office, you're saying we're having marital issues, and it boils down to a husband saying, she just doesn't want to have sex. She never wants to have sex with me. And the woman is saying, I just don't feel pursued and loved. But if you have women that are in the room that's sitting in that room that have been so harmed and you can't help them figure out how to get that healing, you're talking about something that you can't fix in that moment, right?
It's not just like a Bible verse is just going to magically fix that.
You can't just pray over, let's pray that you will hope and long for sex, right?
Yeah.
Like I remember there were seasons where I had to say to CJ, you reaching over in the car and touching my leg feels violating right now.
Yeah.
That's a horrible thing to have to say to your husband.
Yeah.
That's a horrible feeling as a wife to have to be honest about.
Right.
But I remember our counselor saying to me, if you don't tell the truth in how touch impacts you, you guys are never going to get past how to really have true intimacy.
Yeah.
And I can say now, being on the other side, I'm able to talk about it with such freedom.
Right.
I don't have that. I never recoil in CJ's pursuit of me physically. I never feel like, please don't do that. I never have that small, quiet voice that's just like, I know I'm supposed to do this, but I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And that's what so many women are struggling through if they've been harmed in some way. And the stories can be a mile long of what those look like.
Different ways
right?
that it is,
So I love this piece of data, and yet I so long...
Which piece of
the
data?
cuddling data.
Oh, the
how
cuddling
important
part.
it is. This is what got us around to this point,
Okay.
right?
Back through the
Because
list.
cuddling now is something that's so healing and so important in my life. Oftentimes when I'm having a really hard season or something's going poorly, CJ's touch and hug of me that has no sexual, like there's not leading towards anything that has to do with sex, but just a hug and cuddling and being close to me has the power to erase so much in what has happened. But that took so much work to get there.
Yeah.
And I want the church to be the place where people can come and say, this is what has happened to me. I've been so harmed and broken, but I believe that God is bigger and stronger and can bring me full circle to say that cuddling and touching is positive.
Yeah.
You know?
So that's what the data point does is it reveals something. Like if you have a bad sex life and you can't cuddle, in either way, regardless of the sex life, if you're married and you don't want to cuddle with your spouse, that tells us something, right? Like that's like, just like you knowing like my husband should be able to touch my leg and that should be a fine thing. That's not good. Why is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then together being willing, like you said, like, you know, do you want me to go to therapy with you? Like, I'll go with you. Yeah, I want you to be there. And I go and we're sitting, you know, with this therapist. And I'd never been in a therapy office in my life before that. And I'm watching this therapist interact with Renee around this. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, he's so much better at talking to her about this than I was. Like, I'm realizing like, oh, I was going about this completely wrong, you know? And then also that because of that, there have been many seasons in our marriage where we needed to abstain from sex for like safety or anything. But that was one of those where it was like, Renee had to be convinced for a while that I was like, hey, we don't need to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you don't want to have sex, like if it doesn't feel safe to you, if you're still working through this, like I fully want to like put the ball in your court and give you all the power, because that power is taken away from you in your sexual abuse.
Yeah.
And that was like, I learned that by watching and listening to this dude
Yeah.
do therapy. And I was like, oh, I'm seeing what I need to do here.
Yeah. That's
You know what? I lost a train of thought at one point. Something I was going to say
Yeah.
is that there's two routes that you kind of go when you've experienced abuse, whether it's like, childhood sexual abuse or some kind of, sexual encounter that was taken from you later on. You either go in a route of pulling away from physical intimacy or leaning really, really hyper into sexuality.
Yeah.
Which is that same dichotomy in Paul's passage.
Yes.
Licentiousness and asceticism.
Asceticism.
Totally.
Right? Like, and so
Yeah, that's Satan, dude.
that is Satan's
Yep.
favorite
That's what he's
way
doing. Yep.
to really just distort sexuality.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the things I love about the book, The Sexually Confident Wife. It talks a lot about this of like, she had been very harmed sexually. And so she went hardcore into like very, very sexually promiscuous, had pursued a lot of sexuality, but that touch never felt satisfying.
Yeah.
And she talks about that of like, it wasn't satisfying.
Yeah.
For me, it pushed me in the opposite direction of like, I didn't want to be physically touched. I was pretty like, stay away from me.
Colder
I was
to it.
pretty cold and like really in some weird ways, looking back with boyfriends, growing up when you're supposed to be learning about physical intimacy of holding hands or kissing each other. I was so awkward and weird with all of that, but in a really kind of sad way because I was just so broken in that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an important piece of information for you to look at.
Yeah.
Because there's so many people that maybe it's not this massive thing that you've been sexually abused or something like that, but maybe something has happened in your past that broke what you view as safe touch, both for male and female.
Yeah.
So that you do learn to love each other well in that way.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful part of marriage to be able to hold one another and carry each other through physical touch.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how, I mean, it shouldn't be too surprising, but how, God has a desire to work healing in each of us. To what extent, that's between the Lord and us. Some of us are going to pass away with some wounds, and then we'll come back when he does, and he'll say, behold, I make all things new. But nonetheless, he's very actively engaged in the work of healing and redeeming. Yeah. And most of the time, a spouse is one of his, if not his primary tool in accomplishing that in so many ways. Yeah. And it's interesting, CJ, how we were talking about like, okay, the capacity to say, hey, I'm okay with abstaining for a stretch. That's one of the things I think for those who are not, especially if it's a not yet married, that's one of the really powerful things about keeping your sex life in the confines of what the Lord is saying is healthy right now. Totally. Because so again, goes both way, men, women, but it bends to the guy.
Right.
But for a guy who is not married and who's, masturbating and looking at porn, and is just of the opinion that I have a sexual need for release, right, instead of understanding actually what you have is a sexual desire that you are in control of. Yeah. And it's not a thing that you need to release on a regular basis. For that guy who doesn't understand that, they're subject to that. That desire becomes something that feels like a need, becomes arguably a need, becomes an addiction, but it really does not need to stay that. Yeah. And they don't have the capacity to do that. And they're usually of the opinion that, if they're a Christian guy or whatever, that I'll get married someday and then I will have access to this release whenever I want. Totally. But that is not how a relationship works. No. And that's not how I mean,
Yeah.
the doctor's not going to agree with that at a certain point in time. You know, there
Right.
are certain rhythms of life. If you're
Yeah.
going to have kids, that's going to put it off the map
Definitely.
for at least a few weeks.
Yes.
You know,
For sure.
and other things
sure.
will come up through life. You know, and so there
Yeah.
are all sorts of reasons why there will be stretches of time.
Yeah.
And so to be able to say, you know what, as a single guy, I went years without this.
Yes.
So this is no big deal.
Right.
And not to mention the capacity to say to your spouse, hey, like I married you with this
Yeah.
not having been a part of our relationship.
Totally.
You know, oftentimes when I'm counseling,
Yeah.
doing premarital counsel for couples who have been sleeping together, it's a big deal to have that, like, hey, it's not too late to stop sleeping together conversation. Like this, in fact, like the window is closing as you approach your wedding day.
Right.
To get so many of the gains of saying no to this, to get the evidence that you get to hand to each other that says, hey, I loved you and I desired you to the extent that I intended to marry you, and yet I chose not to sleep with you.
Yeah.
How much more 15, 20 years into marriage, when we're having a hard time and there's a coworker that I find attractive who clearly finds me attractive, how much more do I have the capacity to hand you that evidence from our relationship that though I desired you, I was faithful to you and to the Lord.
Right.
And now I will be faithful to you and the Lord, though there's this other person that could ruin our marriage, that I could bring into in unfaithfulness. That's a big deal.
I like that point a lot. I think that is extremely good. That the practice of abstinence as a single person is actually more like a rehearsal for a future opportunity to practice abstinence in your marriage when it's warranted, even if, like you said, that it's just partly being that the frequency of sex isn't, like, if you're looking at pornography and masturbating every day and you think that that frequency is going to exist inside the confines of your marriage, like you're a crazy person. Like, and you know, I'm getting my certification in sex addiction therapy right now. And Mark Huey, who is just joining the elder board, he and I are actually doing an intensive outpatient group that we're going to be starting to address this. And so I've been doing a ton of learning about sexual addiction in particular. And there's a cycle of addiction that begins with preoccupation. Preoccupation is believing that sex is my number one need. And so I become preoccupied with it all the time. It's all I think about. And that's how any addiction is. Okay. And so when you're single or you're dating, what you need to prove to yourself and your future spouse is that your preoccupation, and I threw that language in a little bit yesterday. I don't think I did it until the 11 o'clock where I said something like, if you're single, your preoccupation should not be with sex. It should be with the person of Christ. Yeah. And I use that language because of that research and because of the work I'm doing of, like, you need to be practicing sex being, like you said, something you desire, but not something that you need. Yeah. And that is 100% a dynamic in marriage, right? Because if I view my sexuality as a need, that, like, then I start obligating Renee to fulfill that need and requiring of that her, and I start resenting her if she doesn't meet that need, right? Rather than saying, this is something I desire, but I have total self-control over. And I think that's right. Like, if you're getting engaged or you're dating someone you think you're going to be married and you're struggling with pornography, now's the time to get it out. Yeah. You know, if you're in a relationship and you're struggling physically with each other, now's the time to just stop that. Yeah. For the exact reasons that you're saying. And every moment that you refrain from it is a growth towards not having a preoccupation with sex.
Yeah. I you know, in neurology, they talk about neurons that fire together, wire together. And I know I'm so speaking Bergman right now. This is very, very much in the pool that you guys love to live in. But what I think is so beautiful about that, you know, it's been for anybody who happens to not be familiar with that. It's this idea that's pretty observable even without looking at people's brains, but that when we do something that rewards us, we're building a pathway between that
Definitely.
action and that reward.
For sure.
And so that's true of a million things in life.
Yeah.
It's true of sexual release also,
Yeah.
right? And so we're
Definitely.
building a connection between that reward and that action.
Yeah.
And so when, for example, you look at pornography, you masturbate, you're building a connection to sexual reward
Yeah.
and your phone or your laptop and the novelty of
Yeah.
a different person and different
Right.
actions and different things going on.
Yeah.
Essentially what you're doing is you're building a sexual desire for novelty,
Yeah.
for different, which of course is impossible for a single human being to match the novelty capacity of
For
the
sure.
internet.
Yeah.
But interestingly, I talk about that often as like, and I'm not the only person to use this analogy, but like if you've ever been off-roading, right, you're on a dirt road and you're driving your truck around, and you'll notice when you're driving on these paths, in the woods, there's pre-existing tire tracks, right? Because people have over and over and over again driven their truck. A truck has driven, these tires have driven over this one spot on the dirt road. And over time, especially if it's muddy, right? Like these deep tire tracks get entrenched in there to the extent where they can be so deep that you would have to really yank your steering wheel hard left or hard right to get out of those tire tracks.
Yep.
That's what's being built by engaging with anything, right? That has a reward to it over and over and over again. And so if you have a pornography addiction, for example, it becomes very difficult for you to jump out of those tire tracks and find yourself attracted to something that is not. And that's why a lot of men end up struggling with ED and things like that, unable to actually be aroused and satisfied by real life because they've built this. But interestingly enough, the analogy doesn't stop there, because erosion is just like erosion in the tire tracks and in the dirt road. There is an erosion in our minds. And this is in part what God is talking about, what the Bible is talking about. It says, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. When we choose to not drive down that road slowly, but certainly, the wind and the rain and the grass and all that stuff, it erodes that until eventually you won't know that a truck had ever driven by there.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that this mechanism that God has wired into our minds, our hearts, our bodies, that creates such a problem with pornography or any sort of sexual brokenness that we're going to, was designed by God to create a pathway to our spouse, to tie us deeply to them.
Yeah.
And the result of someone who's being faithful to their spouse and faithful to the Lord is that they find that over time, they become more and more and more and more attracted to their spouse, to the extent that at some point in time, those tire tracks are so deep between you and your spouse that you would have to really yank the steering wheel. Like it becomes more difficult to be unfaithful over time. Never impossible, but much more difficult to do that. And things have quite the capacity to get more rich over time. I love that when you see the way the Lord designed it, because we're so familiar with the way the enemy has broken it. So we are about halfway through a list. So let's keep going through that. It's been fruitful.
It's good.
It's been good. Let's finish that.
So they cuddle. They make sex a priority, not the last item of a long to-do list, which I really address, kind of like your resources. They stay good friends. That was part of that, like building a map of each other's internal world that I mentioned.
Yeah. Could you, I remember thinking when you said that, that's really good. Tell me more. So CJ, that's really good. Tell me more.
So that's from John and Julie Gottman. There's an exercise that they have couples do called love mapping. I like that picture of like, and I've kind of always thought about Renee this way of like, do you like that?
I know what you're going to say.
It's like you guys are married.
It's like we're married. And it's like we've talked about this already before. Renee is this like person that I get to spend my entire life discovering.
Yeah.
Like, she is like territory. And I think this is like, as a man, I was talking about that cultivator, pioneer adventures. Like I'm like on this like adventure of my life to try and understand everything I can about her. Like I want to know her mentally, emotionally, physically, sexually, spiritually. I'm just like this curious person, you know? And so her internal world is like a map, you know, that I'm trying to navigate. And it's sort of like, I'm like marking things and I'm like describing and I'm like, you know, creating this map, almost so that if anyone else, you know, wanted to know everything there was to know about Renee, that they could just read this map and they could learn about her, kind of a thing. And so, yeah, I think that was kind of like the picture there, right? Of like, I'm that, and that'll take my entire life.
Yeah.
And there's this really great theologian named Lewis Smedes. He was a guy that greatly influenced Tim Keller. Tim Keller like quotes him a lot, and so I was like seeing his name a bunch, and then I'm like, oh, I want to learn some stuff directly from you know the source material of Tim Keller. And he talks about how when you get married, you're not married to just one person. You're married to all the versions of them that they will be throughout your marriage. I thought that was really beautiful and profound. Of like, this Renee is so different than the one that I married.
Yeah.
She's equally as exciting and intriguing to me and equally a mystery to me.
Yeah.
And annoying.
No, baby. Nothing about you is annoying.
Right.
Yeah. And so we all, Tim in his book, in him and Kathy's book, Meaning in Marriage, says we all desperately want to be both fully known and fully loved. But we're terrified that either we will be fully known but not loved,
Yeah.
or loved but not known, right?
Yeah.
If you fully see me, like if you traverse the entire map of CJ, my greatest fear is that once you do know me all the way, you're going to be like, I don't want that.
Yeah.
He's gross.
Yeah.
All the worst parts of him are detestable to me. So
Yeah.
that's terrifying. And then the equally terrifying thing is like receiving love. This is probably actually what I struggle a lot with, is like, you like me, but you know, if you really knew me, that you wouldn't love me.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm fully loved, but I'm not fully known.
Yeah.
And in marriage, like, we both long to give and receive that gift. And when we do, it's incredible.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But we do that by asking each other questions,
Yeah.
you know? Open-ended questions.
Yeah.
Not yes or no questions. Not, did you have a good day? Yeah. But how was your day? What was your day like? What did you, that happened? Yeah. What was that like for you? You know, how did you experience that? What was frustrating about that? What was hard about it? Right? All open-ended questions that really like draw out the person. And this is, I mean, it's kind of not fair because I'm a professional counselor, so I'm like trained in open-ended questions, you know, but
even before you went through that,
I think we've both always been like this, of just like, it's really just like, I want to know you.
Yeah.
I want to know what it's like to be inside there.
I think we've had really good marriage mentors throughout our life that we've watched their marriages and gone, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is saying a lot. I think a lot of people don't have a lot of marriage mentors, like people that they're like, wow, I look at them and they had a great marriage. We also had people that were in our life that we watched and we went, I don't want that.
Yeah.
That's been the
Right.
other,
And so we've had those
that's
conversations
the other
of like,
tutor.
let's peel the onion of maybe what we've seen fall apart for other people, not in like a judgmental, you know, invasive way, but like in a way of how do we keep figuring out our own marriage, you know? So
I think that mapping you guys are talking about is like in and of itself really beautiful. The just the idea, the reality of like continuing to search you out.
Yeah.
And then B, I think so fruitful again for, well, this is one of the things that the Lord is using to grow us and mature us. You know, I think there's a profoundly human tendency to project your mind and framework onto every other person, right? I've noticed people that are judgmental of others have a tendency to assume that others are judgmental of them. When it's like, people who are less judgmental have a tendency to assume no one is judging them, you know, and that just, you know, you're not so worried about other people's thoughts, you know, or you're very worried because yours are unkind, right? And we all have a tendency to assume that the rest of everybody else's brain works the way ours does.
Yeah.
And one of the clearest places where we can learn not only that that's not true, but in particular, what other maps of a brain, of a mind, of a heart, of a person might there be is with our spouse. And we start to learn, and then we can actually take that and it might mismatch, but it might match this person. My the map of my spouse might fit this person quite a bit better than mine does. I remember when we were in Southeast Asia doing anti-trafficking stuff in the safe house, there was a young woman who at some point in time we called my wife's Southeast Asian twin because they looked nothing alike at all. But within the course of about a month or two, we realized that in some very fundamental, very important ways, they were wired the same. One of those ways was motivation. And so one of the things that one of the roles that I filled while we were there was the English teacher for the women in the safe house. And this particular woman some days would just shut down because, she's had some things happen in her life that, and so some days it was just like today is not a get stuff done day. Like, and if you push her on the wrong day, like nothing will happen at all, and but then some days she needed to be pushed and she would respond beautifully to it. And all I can say is because her and Colleen were so motivated the same, like the years of relationship with Colleen directly applied to this woman. And so I would walk in to the safe house for English lesson and I couldn't even tell you exactly how I could read it, but I could read it in a matter of minutes, whether this is a push her day or hey, just let it be, like nothing's gonna like if I push her, it's gonna crush her day. Yeah. And that was so fruitful. But let's keep going with the list because it's been good and worth talking.
Yeah. Where was that?
That was mapping. I asked you about, you were talking about.
Yeah. They talk comfortably about their sex life. So that was like, hey, you got to just talk about it, not expect each person to just magically know what to do. They have weekly dates. They take romantic vacations. They are mindful about turning toward. And I only really got to say that part. Like at the end, I was like, he calls sex an act of turning toward, which I thought was really beautiful. And that idea that God designed us to have sex face to face. Yeah. And then he gives.
I wonder if I was the only person when you said humans are the only or among the only.
Among the only.
I was like, what? So thinking about Discovery Channel,
here's my brain. Yeah. So here's my brain. We're similar in this way. Yeah. Many commentators made that reference. And so I'm like, oh, that's lovely. That's preachable. I want to put that in there. Yeah. But then I was like, we can't be the only ones that do. And so I like chat GPT that to find out. And it's a very small number. There's like 3. Well, what and it's they? Only occasionally. I don't remember. On the very I don't remember what else. It doesn't matter. It's not that important.
Like chimpanzees?
I don't know what it is. And even the ones that do, it's like only
seahorses, they're unusual.
Yeah. So that is why I was careful with my words and I said we are among the only creatures who have sex face to face because of it's the Alec Seekins of the world.
Yeah. That's right.
That are going to be like, I'm going to fact check that.
Which person?
Okay.
Which animal?
I'm on to you. Yeah. Okay. So then we should look at the things that people are true of people who had bad sex lives. This is as instructional. They spend very little time together during a typical week. They become job-centered or child-centered, and usually it's the male who becomes job-centered and the female becomes child-centered. So that was why I brought up the whole thing about margin. They talk mostly to each other about their huge to-do lists. So that's something to watch out for. Of like when you're hanging out with your spouse, what do you talk about? And I've noticed this, the great temptation is like, talk about your kids, talk about the things that need to happen, like talk about business, right? And that is where they're like, how was your day? What are you dreaming about right now? What are you struggling with right now? Those kind of questions are much better. They seem to make everything else a priority other than their relationship. So that's with that theme a little bit. Drifting apart and leading parallel lives. So if you're increasingly noticing that you need less and less from your spouse, right? That means you're getting those needs met elsewhere. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're having an emotional affair or that you're like connecting with an old person, or that it doesn't have to be that's being replaced by a specific person. But if generally you're like, I'm pretty much self-soothing across the board, that's a bad sign to look out for. And then he said, are unintentional about turning toward one another. So that turning toward idea is really like, when I'm not okay, I turn towards something.
Yeah.
Right. And we physically do that. Right. Like if you're in a fight, like someone's going to turn their body away. Right. You turn away when you feel like there's danger, or I feel threatened, or I'm against you. I don't want to be vulnerable with you. Right. A turning toward is like a bid for connection. John and Julie Gottman talk about making a bid for connection. Right. And so what are your ways of making bids for connection and turning toward? And if you're not turning towards your spouse, what or who are you turning toward instead?
I remember when we were seeing a Gottman counselor, she was talking about how like a ratio with those bids to connection and rejecting them. I think it was something along the lines of like, hey, like you really want to aim for 2 yeses to every no, or ideally no nos when we're talking about bid for connection. And again, we're in a conversation about sex. We're not explicitly talking about that.
We're just talking about connection.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the whole bids for connection thing is like a really lovely thing to learn. Is like the thing that they would observe these couples in, that John Gottman would like, videotape these couples, and then they would watch these videos. And they, in our training, they would play these back, and it's like a guy like sitting, at the kitchen table reading a paper. And his wife like comes over to stand in the kitchen and like looks out the window and is like, oh, the birds are out bathing. And then it's just silent. He just says nothing. And she pauses. And then she goes, I just love when the birds are in our backyard. Nothing. And then like maybe 2 or 3 more times, she reiterates, right? Something about the birds.
Yeah.
What is happening in the scene? What are you watching? One person making a bid for a connection and the other person totally rejecting it or not noticing it. And so learning, like, your spouse does things.
Yeah.
And they 100% do them to see if you'll just like connect with them.
Yeah.
Right? They're like throwing the ball, and they're going to see if you'll catch the ball and throw it back.
Yeah.
Which is why I mentioned that, like, if your husband throws you the ball, because maybe he never does that, don't drop it.
Yep. Well, and that's such the scenario that like turns into, why did we fight over that moment? But it's like, well, that's why. Because what was happening was I was looking for connection, for intimacy, and you missed it or rejected it. And it's not a, oh, I don't want to talk about birds right now moment. I'm reading the newspaper. It's a, oh, I don't want to connect with you right now moment, or rather, I wanted to connect with you and you didn't.
One of the things, we should talk about some of these for us, like, 'cause one of the things that's funny, and it's a joke now because we do feel like really connected. I don't think there's a lot of failed bids for connection in our
Not
marriage.
really anymore.
But like Renee loves to ask me my opinion about like something with the house, like some paint colors, and what about this and what about that. And number one, I don't care. Like, I'm cool with whatever the color is usually. also, I'm not good at it. You know what I mean? Like, we shouldn't go with whatever.
No.
Like, if she asks me what color I prefer out of 5, like, we shouldn't go with my preference.
Yeah.
You know, because I know that she would regret that, and I actually know that she's not gonna end up going with whatever I say.
It's a trap.
You know what I'm saying?
It's a trap.
It's a trap.
It's a trap.
But like, what it is a bid for connection.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, noticing, like, okay. So now what I will do is I will accept the bid by, like, teasing Renee.
Yeah. It's like a joke.
Which is my favorite way of connecting,
Yeah.
And
is
they'll
to
be
make fun of Renee. Yeah, I'll just make that joke. I'll be like, babe, I don't freaking care, dude. Like, and so I, like, catch the ball and just throw it back to her. I, like, spit on it and throw it back to her, you know, whatever.
Being funny.
What's from your standpoint, like, some of these kind of, like, bids for a connection? Or what do you notice that I do where it's, like, clear that I'm making a bid?
Well, you are not as like.
Let's test you. Let's see if you even know what my bids for a connection
Wrong.
It's not usually in the like the smaller things. Like I'm much more like I want you to be involved in all the little details of life and have that conversation about all the different decisions. I can tell you're looking for a bid for connection when you will come and say something that's been like really hard and you don't really resolve it. Like typically you present everything pretty,
I counsel myself.
Yeah, you counsel yourself and put things
wrap it up.
But you'll say something that's really hard, and I can tell you're waiting for me to just hear you and listen to you, which this is an issue we've had to work through in our marriage.
We should talk about this.
I'm actually the one that's always trying to fix his problems. Like oftentimes it's the reverse where the guy's always problem fixer. I'm like, let me fix this for you right now. I'm like, let me get to a solution, whatever. And so your bid for connection is, are you just going to attune to me? Are you just going to listen to me? Are you just going to like be present with me? Or are you going to offer a solution? You did it. You actually did it before the sermon, and I missed the bid.
You botched it?
You said something, and I was like, it's going to be fine. You're preaching the word of God.
Yeah, I remember.
And you're speaking truth.
On the way to the church.
And I saw your face, and I was like, oh, I didn't say that right. But
she fumbled that one.
Yeah. I mean,
but it's fine. Like I'm able to, like later on say to him, are you feeling okay? Like, do you need something? Do you need to reprocess something that you're trying to work through of what you're going to say?
Yeah.
Or, like that. Now we know each other well enough that he wasn't super wounded in that moment because I don't miss the bids quite as often as I
If I was
used to.
wounded, I'll never let her see it.
That's not true. You will tell me.
Or you'll admit it on a podcast in front of tens of people.
Tens of people.
Literally.
Tens of people.
Maybe 9.
Could even be a dozen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny as you guys are talking about this, I'm thinking, what fruitful thing to just pause and think every so often. What are the bids that are happening?
Yeah.
Like as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about one of the bids that Colleen will often do that I straight up just because it's via iMessage. She'll send me Instagram stories or this or that or whatever, and I'm like, I don't like social media anymore. I got so sick of it in 2020, that I am repulsed by it. So she'll send them with no context, and it's like, so I have to click this video, I have to watch the video.
Yeah.
It's probably about puppies.
Right.
Yep.
Maybe about. I mean, I guess she's moved past the puppies most of the time, but I'll probably half the time, usually not intentionally,
right.
But I'll be like, well, I'm at work. Like, I'll do this when I have time to look at an Instagram video, which usually is at home when I'm sitting next to her.
Right.
And by that point in time, it feels silly to look at a text message.
Oh, so she wants you.
So
she
I'll just
wants you
skip
to
them.
respond in real time.
Yeah, well, I think so.
It's that
but it's
connection
never. But it's not a big
throughout the
deal,
day.
because it's never. I don't think she's ever expressed frustration.
Yeah.
Over I didn't watch that cat video or whatever
Right.
that you sent me.
Yeah.
She will when it's like, hey, I sent you a video about something that like an issue we're having with one of the kids and their health, and
Right, yeah.
I was
Look, this
doing
resolves
my
it.
and it's like watch those, and I'm like I didn't get to them. I'm bad at but
Yeah.
but I don't even just as we're talking, I'm realizing like I don't think she has logged that's a bid for connection. I don't think I have either. But even I find myself just thinking, okay, like your approach of like, well, I can't. It doesn't work for when you're talking about the color of the room or whatever. It's like it doesn't really work for me to engage that in the obvious way.
Right.
but how do I say yes to the connection,
Right.
although no to giving my genuine opinion about the color in the room?
Just to be
Because
having
she doesn't
conversation.
really care about your opinion in the room.
Right.
Otherwise she would take it.
Yeah. Right.
But
Right.
it's that connection. Same thing,
Yeah.
finds me thinking, man, maybe I can skip the videos and send a funny GIF.
There you go.
or whatever.
Yeah, that's what I was
you know?
thinking. Is like, is the response is it about responding to the video she sent you, or is it like you sending her something that's similar?
The connecting over
Again,
thing,
it's just always, and that's where the love mapping comes in. It's like just trying to understand
Yeah, your spouse.
your spouse and what do they love? Like,
Yeah.
even just as silly as it is, asking her like, what is it? What do you love about sending me those?
Yeah.
Like, oh, it's fun for me when I'm just like home during the day and I'm like between naps and doing mom things, or I'm at work or this. I've just like, I'm on my phone and when I see something, I think of you.
Yeah.
I think you'll think it's funny.
Yeah.
Or you'll think it's funny that I think it's funny.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it can be so fruitful to like, I think one difficult thing for a lot of people is mechanizing relational things sometimes, because that feels so unrelational. To say, oh, here's this system and that's a lot of big challenge people can have when they're going through counseling. It's like, oh, you're teaching me active listening, and I'm like, this feels like a lie. Like I'm going to repeat back to you the things that you just said. Like that's not, it feels so insincere when it's a tool and it's like, oh, we're doing the thing our counselor told us we have to do,
Totally.
or scheduling times for date night or for intimacy or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like these things can feel so not the way you want a relationship to be.
Right.
And yet the gains from doing that stuff is sometimes far greater than what you think it would be.
Definitely.
It maybe even equal to or greater to than had it just magically happened.
Definitely.
And I'm so just thinking about, this in particular, it's like, okay, what's the mechanism that I can implement here to make sure that I'm not missing that bid for attention.
I think that speaks to a problem in our culture where we have turned authenticity into an idol, where the Bible doesn't say the goal of our instruction is authenticity. It says the goal of our instruction is love. And for many, many cultures, way before the West and America, you behaved in order to believe. You did actions in order to form and reform your affections towards something, right? And so we have this like false sense of like, if I can't do it authentically, I shouldn't do it at all.
Yeah.
And that's not, I don't think, a biblical principle.
Yeah.
I think it's similar to like anything that is good and beautiful requires like a season of discipline. So like, learning scales on the piano, like if you're going to learn like classical music, the discipline required to learn scales and learn about intervals and learn about timing feels very like inauthentic, and it's not music yet.
Yeah.
But you can't make beautiful music if you don't learn the basics and you don't learn scales. So that's what you're seeing there is like when a couple needs to go to couples counseling and practice what might feel like very inorganic and authentic new behavior patterns.
Yeah.
It's because you like tried to play music to make beautiful music, having never learned anything about music. And so the music you're making sucks.
Yeah.
And so it's like you need to go back and learn the fundamentals.
That's so
right.
good. Yeah.
Like going and learning like the fundamentals of dance before you can ever get on the dance floor.
Yeah.
Is what that is.
No, that's so good. Awkward, clunky, and yet
It is
fruitful. And
yes.
and if you're learning a new skill at the same time, you do realize like, oh, there is like, feels good to sit down at the piano and fail to play a song my first time, but
Totally.
like get a couple of chords or a couple, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like to have that satisfaction of like, okay, that was bad. I don't want anyone to hear it,
Right.
but it was good.
Yeah.
And then of course at some point there's that like, okay, this is difficult and frustrating and I'm pushing through. But I think in the same way, right? Sitting in a room with a third party, a counselor or someone who's walking you through how to communicate with each other can be profoundly fruitful.
Yeah, dude.
Although a little
Yeah.
part of you feels silly, it's like this is good.
Well, dude, when I was taking Greek in my undergraduate, it's like we had to translate all of Matthew 5 and the whole book of 1 John from Greek to English. There was nothing like fun about that. It was like tedious and cumbersome, and it was like, oh my gosh, as if I'm ever going to like do this in a sermon, right? But that work that I put in when I was in my early 20s bears the fruit now, right? Like if you felt like the Lord is using me in my preaching, I can't not point back to those times of just like being disciplined, right? So any good thing, any job that anyone has requires that. And so why shouldn't our relationships, you know?
Renee, I'm wondering what would you say is one of the mechanisms or whatever that you've implemented and that you've seen CJ implement that it's had the most pay dirt in your marriage?
That's a good question.
Or one of?
I think letting the other person grow into someone new. I think it's one of the hardest things to do in a marriage and in a relationship, right? To watch someone change and become someone new and learn to love that version of the person.
Yeah.
Right? So like we've been married for 22 years. The different iterations of CJ are so vast. And there's been some seasons of growth that I think we would all say this, like where there's like, it might be growth, but it's not necessarily the growth that you like, right? And so
A couple of CJs in there that weren't your favorite iterations.
there's been some iterations, right? But like that's what relationship is, right? It's like learning to love someone even at their just grossest and ugliest. And we have both done that. I have had some really gross, ugly times in our marriage, and so has he, that we've had to go, but I still choose to really, truly love this person, not just put up with.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of work. I think we had to really understand the art of that in our marriage and what that looked like in that, like, and I think we're still figuring that out, you know, how to do that well. I think that's one. And then I think something that we still keep working on it, but not letting there be like a third component in our marriage that overtakes. So meaning like either a work situation or like, you know, when we were in ministry in San Francisco, that was something we had to really work through with a spiritual director that we were seeing, was like ministry had become this third person in our marriage that was kind of overtaking. And it was no longer just CJ and Renee. It was CJ and Renee and everybody else's junk that, you know, was filtering in, and this like cog that we were constantly talking about. And it's easy to do because it's much easier to have like a third leg to kind of be annoyed at than to actually look at each other and go, I'm actually annoyed with you and how you're interacting with what's happening in your job, and vice versa. Right. And so we still work really hard at this, of like making sure that our kids aren't the primary thing that we only talk about, that our job isn't the only primary thing that we talk about, that we're looking at each other in each other's eyes and saying, what do you care about?
Yeah.
What's exciting to you these days? Even if it's not anything that's for real that you're going to do.
That's good.
Like just continuing to dream and know each other and not let this other entity take over.
Yeah.
And I think you have to do that every day, all the time. Like I think it's something you have to work on all the time because it's natural for all of us to add this other element into marriage.
That's good. So. I've got 1 to 2 questions from our survey. So we at least just chip away at it.
All right, let's do it.
And maybe I can even convince you guys to do a bonus episode at some point, and we can smash
I'll do a
through
bonus
a bunch
episode
of these.
on that. Yeah.
But I think we'll just keep in the category, you know, I kind of categorize marriage, singleness, divorce. We'll just keep on brand for today's podcast of the marriage one. So first question, I could say see this entire podcast plus CJ's sermon, but maybe we can just shift into pastoral or therapist mode and, actually answer this person, although we lack all the context for their question. But simply put, what do you do when your sexual needs are not met? If you want to just respond to someone.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to recognize that in God's paradigm, sex is not your highest need. He is. So that's the first thing, right? What I said earlier about not being preoccupied with sex. Making sure that your sexual needs are placed in the right position in your life. Then I think allow yourself to grieve. Grieve fully and openly that loss. So have people in your life that will hold that grief for you, express that grief, cry about that, lament it, be frustrated, be sad about it. I'm assuming this person is maybe like married and they're just like unfulfilled in their marriage.
Yeah.
Do we think that's probably a fair
let's assume
assumption?
that. And I'm kind of thinking, let's assume you're talking to a husband, and we might ask Renee your take talking to a woman. I think we often might not assume that, but that is the case for some.
So we're picturing like I'm speaking to
You're
like
talking
a guy,
to a guy who's saying that
hey,
to you, who's married.
I'm unfulfilled sexually in my marriage to my wife. So I would like attune to him by just being like sad with him about that. Like, man, like, tell me more about like what it is you desire from sex and why it's so important to you. And like, have there been times where it has been fulfilling in your marriage? And tell me about those times. Okay. Really just like connecting with what he's experiencing emotionally, right? Again, before like giving advice and solving problems, just like being present with him and just grieving. Like that's really sad, that would be very painful. And then asking questions like, is there a time or is there something that you think has, caused a rift there? Did you notice like when that began to be the case, Okay, let's be like really curious together. There's probably some things that your wife like needs to say to you, wants to say to you, or there's like barriers that either she doesn't feel safe to do that, or she doesn't know. Something's happening outside of her awareness, or something's happening inside of her awareness. And so, are you the type of man that is like safe and loving and curious enough to give your wife the impression that she could tell you whatever she wanted to tell you, and you would not get defensive, you would not blame shift, you would not coerce, that you would truly just say, hey, I want to be your helpmate in this. I want to be your brother in Christ right now, not just your spouse. To try to get down to the root of what's happening and really like love your wife enough to say like, hey, I want to walk with you in this. I do think that like God wants us to have sex. I think that's important. But notice just like the tone and timbre of my voice when I just said that, right? Just such a like, hey babe, like, I understand this is what's happening for you. Like, I don't want to put any pressure on you that doesn't need to be there. But I think we both know like God designed us for sexuality. What can we do? What do you need from me? Yeah. How can I help you? How can I serve you in this? That'd probably be my posture.
What about Renee responding? Same scenario, but you're speaking to a wife who's saying that.
I actually just was counseling someone through this, and they were really questioning whether or not they wanted to move forward in a divorce because of this. And in having that conversation, the questions that I was asking were, where do you feel like things went wrong? Like, when did it go askew? Can you point to like a moment that you felt unwanted? by your husband, and all of a sudden that shifted. Can you go back to that moment with your spouse and ask them, can we unpack this? I think this is when I started to feel unloved or unwanted. And even in this conversation, I said to the woman, I really encourage you to do this in a very gentle way, right? Like, approach it with curiosity and love, not pointing a finger and being demanding, right? That goes back to CJ's final point in his sermon.
Yeah.
Never, ever use scripture as a way to point to say, you have to do this.
Yeah.
Right. And the more we talked, the more I think it became clear that she was afraid to actually have that conversation with her spouse.
Yeah.
And so then we said, okay, so what are some troubleshooting things that we need
Right.
to do? Do we need to sit before a pastor together? Do we need to go
Yeah,
to
third
counseling
party.
together? Do you need a space where, like, you're looking, you're doing this,
Right.
sitting next to you, but looking at,
Yeah.
the person that's in
Right.
front of you, saying something to the person that
Yeah.
you really need to say it to?
Right.
Sometimes that's helpful. And then, I think that if any time in a marriage that someone's not being fulfilled sexually, you've got to back up and have more of the conversation of, like, what's happening relationally? Because sex is an outpouring
Yeah.
of intimacy in relationship.
Yeah.
So both for men and women, I would say to both parties, you have to back up and figure out what's going on with you guys relationally, that sex is not what you desire.
Right.
And that might be, in talking to the wife on the other side of, like, if you're going from the man's perspective, saying he's not fulfilled, being curious. CJ brought this up about, for women, what's going on with your hormones? Like,
Yeah.
let's talk about the physical realities of what happens for women after they have babies, or they've struggled through infertility, or
Yeah.
they have, raised children at home, or maybe they're working full time and have kids at home, and
Right.
they are double duty all the time.
Yeah.
All of those worlds are impacting a female's anatomy and libido so much.
Yeah.
And you just can't discount how much that
No.
plays into it. And I think so many times couples that's like the last on the list of the thing that they're thinking about. And then
Right.
you bring it up and you maybe get some help in it, and you're like, oh, wow, that helped.
I wasn't even sure I was going to bring that one up. And then Renee's like, you got to leave the hormone thing in there,
Yeah.
because some people just don't even realize that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately, this is like coming back to just like what has happened in, culture with women, and this struggle between women not feeling like they're, seen in culture, is a lot of studies and medical, like, advancement and whatnot is done on men, because men's hormones are
Right.
stable and not on women. And so, there's all these women that there's, like, not a lot of research for women on what happens when
Yeah.
things get broken, So you got to go searching for it.
Yeah.
And you got to have a spouse that says, let's care about this. And let's invest some money in figuring out if there's something physically happening between
Yeah.
us. Obviously, you got to talk about the relational stuff. Got to deal with all the intimacy things, but don't discount the physical.
Yeah.
Satan loves to come after the physical,
Yeah.
Anything he has to.
Anything
He'll
he
do
can
anything he has to.
to destroy
If that's
marriages
the only thing
and
left,
relationships.
he'll go after
Great.
that.
Let's figure out how
Yeah.
to destroy hormones.
Yeah.
Don't let him win. We have
Yeah.
enough advancements out there. Get the hormones.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
will
I
help.
mean, we are one person,
Yep.
and it's and health in all parts of who we are
Yep.
Yeah.
is a fruitful thing,
Yep.
and it rarely is it all this
Yes.
one part of
Right.
who I am.
There's all these.
It's
different
almost always all these other things,
Yeah.
And at the same time, we always have. So even for the person who, like, oh, it is clearly hormonal, and really there's nothing else going on there. It's like, okay, there's a thing to see if we can adjust, but at the same time, the love we're engaging in is a decision that we're making, right? And so, so no amount of reason is ever, I'm fumbling. You guys can sweep up after I get out what I'm trying to say. It's so fruitful to find out why, for so many things, and I'm not even just talking about I have less libido,
Right.
and that's a really most of the time a necessary thing when we're dealing with major components in our life, major things going on. The why is rarely, if ever, an excuse. As to say like, I've lost volition, I've lost autonomy. I mean, up until the point at which the why is a loss of autonomy and volition, which, it can be. So we do always have the choice to do whatever is right in the situation. Now, all of that, I think in the context of this conversation, it's so easily distortable. So please add all the asterisks as to what I just said if I'm making any sense. But I think of a kid with ADHD, who genuinely, for whatever reason, actually has ADHD.
Right.
That's that kid's why for getting up and screaming in the middle of class and running around the room.
Totally.
That's not his excuse for doing that. You know what I mean? And that hopefully his parents are parenting well enough to teach him, okay, this is hard and challenging. In a different context, it would be fine. And in a different country, this wouldn't even be a problem. But here we are. Let me help parent you to the point where, you can channel that into appropriate ways. And maybe it's 10 times harder for you to sit down in class than everyone else. But I was going to pull you guys into a beefier question. But let's give you just a medium one and ask for a succinct answer here.
Okay, got it.
We're going long here. And we can loop back around this on the bonus episode if we need to. I think you guys can do a punchy one, and we'll want to do more here. But are we going against God's plan by choosing to not have children?
Ooh.
I know. I don't have a lot of short answer questions on there for you, but
the quick answer is there's no command in Scripture to have children. You're not in sin.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
there is commandment to be fruitful and multiply, but it's
that's not devil's advocate.
That's not a commandment. That's the cultural mandate.
Yeah.
That's God's intention for humanity, but it's not in the Ten Commandments.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that's where everybody's brain went.
Yeah, well,
probably the second.
Let me clarify.
Not commandment.
So the Old Testament commandments we have left are the 10 Commandments, right? The sacrificial, ceremonial part of the law. And even that in there's no you must have children. If you don't, it's an act of disobedience, right?
Yep.
Now, if we just had this conversation the other day.
We did.
Somehow I knew.
If you don't want to have children, I'm very curious about that. Because it's the same reason that if you don't want to get married, I'm curious about that. And I'm curious in general, but I think those are warranted curiosities. Yeah. Tell me more about that. Tell me what is behind. So to your question, what you just said earlier, what's the why behind that? Usually, and funny enough, this is my one takeaway from Rob Bell's book, Sex God, is he had this whole section where it was this is about that. Do you remember that?
Yep.
This is really about that. So what's that this is about? What is behind your desire to not have children?
Yeah.
I'm curious about that. Because if sin hadn't entered the world at all, and you received instead of receiving a sin nature from Adam and Eve and subsequently all the generations, you inherited a nature without sin, you would have children. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah.
You would perfectly fulfill the cultural mandate. And so is there fear, insecurity? What are parts of those? You have lots to say about this too. So Because you're walking through some people right now, they're
Yeah.
asking that question.
Yeah.
Right? Some friends of ours.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to the coin because I've watched both sides. I'm thinking specifically of someone that I know that did not want to have children. The other person did want to have kids. They chose to walk into marriage anyways, even though people maybe kind of had some like, hey, how's this going to go for you guys?
Right.
Was convinced into having a child. It has been very, very, very rough, right? So like children are not something to just like have and, hey, it'll be all right,
Yeah.
right? Like there should be a lot of care and concern around having kids, right? Like I think we should long to parent well and pour into our kids and have love for our kids. So if someone truly is not wanting to have children, I would say to them, I don't want you to have kids just because people tell you you should have kids.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? Because those kids will feel that, and that's going to be very painful. If you are willing to do the work around why you're not going to have kids, I think you might come to a different conclusion.
Yeah.
So this most recent conversation that I'm having with someone, we start listing different kids that are hard, and we're like kind of laughing about it. And I'm giving like all the caveats. Well, that person's parent. And so that
Yeah.
makes sense why they're like that. And then I remind this person, I said, they come out as babies, not as teenagers.
Yeah.
If they came out as teenagers, nobody would have kids. I mean, I love my teenagers, but that's a time in life where
Also,
you're like,
who wants to birth that size of a human?
right?
Nobody.
So they come out as babies for a very specific reason. It's so that they're cute and wonderful and need you and want you and vice versa, right? Like there's design in it and your body longs for them and all those things. And so those things do happen when you work through all of it. But if someone can't get to the root of why they don't want kids and they get like kind of bullied into having kids, I usually think it goes pretty poorly. So
Yeah.
I would say to someone that if they're really like both on the same page and they're like, "Oh, we just really don't want children and we feel comfortable with that." Now, what I would say to those people is if you're going to follow Jesus and you want to have good relationships with other people in the church and with your family and whatnot, be good aunts and uncles.
Right.
Be
Yeah.
great at coming alongside your friends that do have kids and
Yeah.
say, hey, you guys go away for the weekend. We'll stay
Right.
with them for
Have
the
spiritual
2
children.
nights. Have spiritual children. And I've experienced that. I've seen people
Yeah.
that have done
We have
that.
we have a couple like that in our life who they don't want to have kids, but they have invested tremendously in our kids.
Yes.
And it's beautiful.
And it's wonderful. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm amazed at it. I hope that someday the Lord changes their hearts in that.
Yeah.
But if he doesn't, the amount of people that they have the power to impact because they view their life as still an offering. So this couple, I mean, they just pour out their life for other people. For a lot of young people, they like minister to people that are teenagers and they totally pour out for them. That is super impactful on the family,
Yeah.
structure because they have these people that are pouring into them that love Jesus that are saying you're valuable and I have so much to say to you.
Yeah.
So
I think that's so good. I mean, I would just summarize by saying, yeah, there's not a blanket response to that. The Lord has a different plan for every individual. Children are a definitive blessing for the
Definitely.
Lord.
yes.
And
sure.
there are many, 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 many people who the Lord calls to have children who run away from that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're and perhaps in active disobedience.
Yeah.
And yet there are certainly some that the Lord says, my best plan for, I mean, Jesus
Right.
didn't have any earthly children.
Right.
think
There
about that
are
all the
clearly
time,
some
yeah.
people where that is not what he's calling. And yet, again, I love that you guys are, the way I would summarize kind of your last point there is, but you don't get an out on kids.
Yeah.
Right.
You might get an out on having kids.
Right.
Even raising kids, but you don't get an out on kids because that is,
Yes.
they are chief in the
Right.
kingdom of God.
Yeah, for sure.
And
totally.
you are not a full follower of Jesus if you are not investing in children in some way.
It's true.
And yeah. Well, let's, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Looking forward to our, the bonus episode that I got you guys to promise to, on camera. But thank you guys so much. Thanks for being so open, so fruitful. This conversation was fruitful for me, and I'm certain fruitful for a lot of people. So thank you guys for that a
You're
lot.
welcome.
And
Happy to do it.
yeah, thank you for hanging with us, listening. Hey, if you're at Living Streams and you're a woman struggling with some stuff, Renee is amazing.
I'd love
What
to
a
meet with you.
resource that we have for that. CJ, we don't pay him, so
I'm all right.
you get him on
I don't
Sundays,
have
but
time for you.
He's pretty great, but but no, we really do. We have an awesome staff of people who love connecting with you. We've had a flood of people with these last few series wanting counseling and help with that, and bring it on, because we would love. I'd love to see Living Streams be notably healthier and stronger in marriages and families than the world outside of us. So thanks for hanging with us, and we will see you on Sunday.